Hello, everybody. My name is Marina, and I am the Stewardship Coordinator with the Friends of Netarts Bay, Watershed, Estuary, Beach, and Sea, which we like to abbreviate to WEBS. And I am really excited to welcome you to this event, Beaches, Birds, and Beyond, Community Science in Action at Netarts Bay. We have an awesome panel with us today. And everybody on this panel leads a community science project that you can participate in on the Oregon coast. So our panelists are going to be sharing about their community science projects. And we're really focusing on the impacts of those projects tonight. So why they matter and how they are making the world a better place right now. Now, for anybody who is not familiar with WEBS, we are a small nonprofit working to sustain the Netarts Bay area. So that ranges from Cape Lookout to Cape Mears through education and stewardship. And we fundraise through grants and private donations to support hands-on STEM-based education programs for K-12 students, community science engagement opportunities like all of the things you will hear about today, and community learning opportunities like this event. And we really believe that those opportunities should be available to anybody in the community. So we work really hard to offer them for free. And we really appreciate all of your donations that make that possible. Now, before we get started here, I want to launch a poll to get a sense of everybody's experience and sort of familiarity level with community science. So we'll go ahead and do that. All right, poll is up, so take a second and let us know before we keep going. Okay, we got responses coming in. Very cool. All right, so it looks like we've got quite a mix. Definitely a few folks in here who are not so familiar with community science, which is awesome. I'm really glad that you've joined us, and this will hopefully be an awesome introduction. And also quite a lot of folks who have participated in community science projects. So hopefully this will be a good opportunity for you to learn what the impact of your work has been. Great. So thank you. We can go ahead and share the results. All right. So from that poll, just do that. All right, this is what we're looking at. So very cool. Since we have a mixed group here, I want to take a few minutes to define a couple key terms that we're going to be hearing a lot tonight. And those terms are citizen science, community science, and participatory science. Now, these all mean the same thing. You can use them interchangeably. The one sort of caveat that I'll put there is that citizen science is sort of the original term that we've used. And a lot of folks are moving away from the term citizen science in the interest of sort of divorcing this work from a person's citizenship status. So a lot of folks are moving more towards community science or participatory science instead. But with that said, all of these terms refer to a model of doing science, of generating knowledge, where members of the community, so all of you, regular people who don't necessarily have to have PhDs, are able to participate in the scientific process. And often that means collecting data for projects that are led by researchers or professional scientists, like all the folks on our panel. But any steps of the scientific process can be done by community scientists, which means that in addition to data collection, community scientists can also ask new questions, design new protocols, or get involved with data analysis and reporting. It all just kind of depends on the design and the goals of the project. Which is all to say that community science can be really powerful. And it allows us to ask questions that we otherwise would not be able to address. And there's a few reasons for that. First, there are a lot more community members and potential community scientists than there are professional scientists, which means that community science has the power to cover a way bigger geographic range than a single professional scientist ever could. And for similar reasons, community science enables really long-term studies because new volunteers can always get involved and sort of keep a project running in the longer term. And the last really important benefit that I want to touch on of community science is that community scientists are the experts of their communities. So folks who live in Netarts, you are the experts of Netarts. You know where to go to look for certain flora or fauna. You know what is normal and what is not in your backyard, in the area where you live. And professional scientists who don't live in the community don't necessarily have that lived experience or that knowledge. So your contributions are really super valuable to the scientific community. So the way this evening is going to work, now that we all have that sort of foundation in what community science is and why we care about it, is that each of our panelists is going to give a short presentation to kind of introduce you to the project that they lead and what they're learning from recent data from those projects. And then we're going to have a moderated panel discussion, and we'll have some time for open Q&A from the audience at the end of the event. So please, as questions come up, put them in the chat and we will save them for the end of the event. During the Q&A, we will feed them to the panelists. And I think we're ready to get started. So real quick, I want to just very briefly introduce our panelists. So when I say your name, can you just give a wave so everybody knows who you are and who we're talking about, and then we'll get into presentations. So first up, Jess Myers from NOAA Marine Debris. All right, so that's Jess. Then we have Kara Gates from the Bird Alliance. We've got Joe Liebezeit, also from Bird Alliance. We've got Allie Brown from Coast. And then we've got Chloe Kennedy from U.S. Fish and Wildlife. Awesome. Okay, so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jess to get us started. And Jess is with NOAA's Marine Debris Program, and she supports data verification, engaging with partners, and communicating science for the Marine Debris Monitoring and Assessment Project. So, the floor is yours, Jess.
Awesome. Thanks, Marina. Hi, everyone. As Marina said, my name is Jess Myers, and I'm the monitoring specialist for NOAA's Marine Debris Program. And I'm here today to talk about the Marine Debris and Monitoring and Assessment Project. Next slide, please. So the project goals that we're going to cover, next slide, are talking about MDMAP, which is the short term for Marine Debris Monitoring Assessment Project, aims to document the amount and type of marine debris along shorelines, specifically focusing on debris that's larger than 2.5 centimeters, which is about the size of a bottle cap. Next slide. The monitoring of marine debris through long-term monitoring is what we aim to do. And additionally, we are looking to aim to detect the amount and type of marine debris over time, guide and evaluate efforts to reduce marine debris from getting to the shoreline, and provide tools to partners so they can not only contribute to MDMAP, but incorporate their own monitoring goals as well. Next slide, please. I want to give a quick glimpse of all the partners that we have involved in the MDMAP that make it possible, as well as our participants that aren't associated with groups. Next slide. Now we're going to look at what it's like to contribute to MDMAP. Next slide. In general, you'll set up a 100-meter site that you return to regularly, and each time you go, you're going to randomly select 4 or more transects within that site. And the transect here is that dark tan rectangle you see running perpendicular to the shoreline. When surveying the, oh yeah, you can go to the next slide. When surveying the transect, one by one, you're going to categorize the debris that you find within them. And in a standard survey, it can be completed by up to 8 people, and you can adapt this for larger groups by selecting just more transects. It takes less than 30 minutes to watch the training videos and review our protocol documents. Ideally, surveys would take place monthly, but we do understand that time commitments and project goals may not match that frequency, so some groups do quarterly or yearly, depending on what they need. Next slide. We currently have over 600 sites and 7,000 surveys across the world. Our data collected from our participants has been used to support 8 student projects as well as many scientific publications and reports. Next slide. In the next slide, I'm going to be showing you graphics that can be downloaded from MDMAP and kind of how you can look at them. Next slide. So starting with Netarts Bay, we have 2 sites. We're going to zoom out from there to look at how this goes. So at the top of the slide, you can see that circle pie chart, and this shows the composition of marine debris from the surveys. We can see the material types that we have in our general data breakdown. And I just want to highlight that plastic is the most common debris type found, and processed lumber is the second most common found in Netarts Bay. I want to also highlight that for each of these, I'm going to be doing the top 3 items. So plastic other, we have subcategories within material types. And other is just a catch-all for the things we're not directly monitoring. And then we have hard and foamed fragments, which are just broken pieces of those debris types. Can you hit ahead 2 slides? Thank you so much. So we're going to zoom out to Oregon, and we look at how there's 34 sites, so we've grown a bit. The plastic composition jumps up to 91%, but otherwise it's similarly tiered to what Netarts Bay sees, and the top 3 items are really similar there. And then if we zoom it all the way to all of the MDMAP sites, we can see that plastic kind of averages out to 85% composition. And instead of processed lumber, we actually have metal being the second highest common item, and then glass following behind that. And instead of plastic other, bottle caps are the most common there. Next slide, please. You can also download a debris load over time of your site or a number of sites. So in Netarts Bay, sampling started in 2023, and you see a peak in the debris load, which is on our y-axis, in January of 2024. And then it kind of steadies out back to, kind of where it was before that into the present. Next slide. So when we're applying these results, we can look at a few examples for different policy and regulatory changes and just community impacts. Next slide. So back in 2013, the Olympic Coast National Marine Debris Volunteers noticed and began tracking what we called yellow rope snippets on their surveys. They were associated with the shellfish industry, and about a year after surveying, they started an outreach program for the shellfish growers. The graph here shows the number of ropes found over time, and you can see that in 2017, there was a significant decrease in the number of ropes observed. Because of the effort of 191 volunteers, a removal and recycling program was started, which directly involved this shellfish industry, and over 800 pounds of these snippets were recycled. Next slide. We also saw across Virginia, local partners came together to monitor 4 sites along Virginia's coast. With the data collected, they were able to establish a baseline for marine debris in the state, which helped inform and evaluate the effectiveness of their marine debris reduction plan. And they were able to determine regionally relevant debris items to focus their prevention efforts on. Next slide. Lastly, instead of making policy, we can look at policy effectiveness. So a paper was done comparing the container deposit legislations between states that had these container deposits where you give a bottle and get 5 cents back, and those that did not. And this assessment found that states with these deposit stations had 40% less beverage container debris in their surveys than those that didn't. Next slide. So this last slide just has a QR code to send you to our monitoring toolbox. This covers how to get started. It has all of our training materials. Also, how is the MDMAP data used? You can look at the reports that involve those. Some really great resources for you, as well as our email to reach out with any questions that you may have. And I want to thank everyone for this time.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We will, just so everybody knows, we will be sending a follow-up email after this event where we will include email addresses and all of the information you need to learn more about all of these projects. So that will be coming to you in another form. But thank you so much, Jess. Next up, we have Kara, who is a coastal community science biologist with the Bird Alliance of Oregon, to talk to us about plover patrol. So go for it, Kara. Thank you.
Cool. Thanks, Marina. Hey, everyone. I'm Kara, and I coordinate Plover Patrol. This is a community science program that monitors western snowy plovers on Oregon's north coast. We do this in close partnership with Oregon State Parks, and the program's been around since 2018. Next slide, please. So our kind of main overarching goals are to monitor snowy plovers at 6 sites in Clatsop and Tillamook counties. And some of the questions that we're trying to answer with these monitoring efforts are, what sites are plovers occupying on the North Coast, particularly as that pertains to snowy plover management areas? How successfully are they breeding every year? And what causes nest failure? And these data are informing snowy plover management and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service recovery goals because this is a federally listed threatened population. So these data are feeding into these metrics so this population can hopefully eventually be delisted and deemed recovered. We also seek to engage the community and provide snowy plover related outreach to the general public. And kind of at the base of all of this are just some plain old legal requirements under the Endangered Species Act. So I won't go into the dirty details, but basically in close partnership with state parks, we're helping to meet habitat conservation plan requirements. Some of those are related to monitoring. Next slide, please. Cool. So why is our work important? It all boils down to this incredible little bird we call the snowy plover. This is one of our resident coastal shorebirds. It's resided and nested along the Oregon coast on sandy beaches and sand spits for millennia, but it's had a really hard time in the last 100 years due to a trifecta of threats, including habitat loss, predation, and human disturbance. Next slide, please. So you can see in the early 90s, the population hit this all-time low of about 30 to 50 birds along the Oregon coast. So at this point, they were totally absent from the North Coast. And in 93, they were listed as threatened under the ESA. And since that listing, and thanks to management actions, the population has steadily increased, and the Oregon population is actually doing really well, which is awesome. Next slide. And they've also come back to the North Coast. So they have returned to nest in Clatsop and Tillamook counties just in the last 10 years. And our community scientists in Plover Patrol have been at the forefront of capturing this exciting recolonization. Next slide. So what do our community scientists do? They wear many hats. They are out there conducting nest monitoring and plover detection surveys. They are interacting with the public and providing outreach. They are collecting data on beach recreation and violations in the snowy plover management areas. They are collecting resites of banded snowy plovers. They're helping out with habitat enhancement events like beach cleanups, and they are collecting data on predators in the nesting habitat. Next slide. So this shows our program's effort over time. So you can see we've had a really steady increase in the number of our community scientists, which is awesome. 2024 being a record year at 56. These are folks that came from at least 8 different counties in Oregon and Washington, which is awesome. But we've also quadrupled our survey effort in just the last few years. So we have more eyes on the beach, more boots on the ground, and this has allowed the quality of our data to significantly increase in the last 3 years. Next slide, please. So because this is a federally listed threatened species, there are some fairly steep training requirements. These are U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service minimum requirements to survey for snowy plovers. So all of our community scientists complete a 4-hour classroom training where they learn all about snowy plover biology and survey protocol. And then depending on the type of survey that folks want to get involved with, there are different field training requirements. So plover detection surveys are done from the wet sand, like this person here. And this is considered a low disturbance zone. It's out of the nesting area, so that only requires 1 field training. But nest monitoring is considered high disturbance, high risk. You're actually in the nesting area. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service requirement is at least 20 field training hours. These are the same training hours that I had to complete before I started nest monitoring. And we understand that our community scientists are graciously volunteering their time, so we don't have any strict minimum requirements for commitment, but at least once a survey a month is ideal. Obviously, more is better, more long-term is better, so you can gain experience. And our surveys range from 1 to 6 hours depending on the survey site. Next slide. So what have we learned since 2018? We know that snowy plovers are nesting at least 5 sites in Clatsop and Tillamook counties. So these are these 5 yellow sites, 2 of which they're nesting at both the north and south ends of the estuary. So that's at Nicanicum Inlet and Sitka Sedge or Sand Lake. Clatsop Spit is particularly important. So this site has repeatedly had the highest number of nests and the highest productivity of all North Coast sites. Dogs are the #1 leading disturbance on the North Coast, and crows are the most commonly observed nest predator. Next slide, please. So here's a snapshot of our productivity data over time. So in blue are the number of nests found each year, and orange are the minimum number of fledglings. So you can see they've steadily been increasing their nesting effort on the North Coast. Our 10-year average nest success, or the percentage of nests that hatch, is 32%. That's actually pretty good, but it's a little bit under our goal. So to have a stable or growing population, we want at least 35% nest success, and more ideally closer to 40. So we're not quite there yet. Next slide, please. So bringing this to Netarts Spit, this is an unmanaged snowy plover management area, which sounds pretty contradictory, but it's currently unmanaged because it's still considered unoccupied, or we have not found evidence of nesting in recent years. So the last documented nest was found here in 1982, and there have actually been pretty rare sightings of snowy plovers in the last couple decades. So only 3 by Plover Patrol since 2018, 2 of which were actually in 2024, which is exciting, and only 1 during U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's biannual censuses of the Oregon coast since 2001. And my hunch that they have not recolonized this site is because it's fairly low quality habitat. So the majority of this spit is bordered by these steep cliff-like foredunes, which are formed by European beach grass. And snowy plovers don't like this. Next slide. So this is what kind of ideal nesting habitat looks like. This is a habitat restoration down near Florence. They like really wide, gradually sloping sandscapes, and they like a 180 to 360 degree unobstructed view shed. So they want to be able to see all the way around them. This gives them a little more advantage to predators, and it gives them plenty of space to lay their eggs outside of the tidal zone. Next slide. So when non-native grasses build these steep foredunes, this is putting their nests in the tidal zone as that vegetation is encroaching westward and it's shrinking or narrowing our beaches. Next slide. Here's another reason why they don't like this kind of habitat. This obstructs their view shed, and this kind of gives an advantage to predators that can sneak up behind them. Next slide. So unfortunately at Netarts Spit, the area that kind of mimics ideal nesting habitat where it's wide open is the end of the spit, and it's a pretty small area that's actually out of the tidal zone. So this is my guess as to why they have not returned to this site to nest. And I think if we want snowy plovers to return here, we should consider habitat restoration. Next slide. So Plover Patrol's data is informing U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's recovery goals. Like I mentioned earlier, it's feeding into those productivity and population metrics. It's also feeding into OPRD's Habitat Conservation Plan, which has site-specific management plans along the Oregon coast for snowy plovers. So as we gain in new or as we gain new data and new information, we can be adapting our management plans to best protect this population. So that can pertain to adapting our management area boundaries or changing our habitat restoration or our enforcement or more education and outreach. So a few real examples that Plover Patrol data has informed are the creation of 2 habitat restoration areas on the North Coast at Nehalem and Sitka Sedge, and the creation of plover docents at Nehalem and Sitka Sedge. I think these kind of went out, I think, around COVID, but we're working with state parks to reinstate those programs. And the addition of interpretive signs at Oregon State Parks. So next slide. I just want to say thank you to all of our community scientists. I see that a couple are in the crowd tonight. So this program really would not be possible without all of you. You are much appreciated.
Great. Thank you so much, Kara. Awesome to see that we're getting a few questions in the chat. I promise we are saving those for the Q&A at the end. And next up, we have Joe Liebezeit, who is with the Bird Alliance of Oregon, and he works with a team to move forward habitat and wildlife protection from the coast to eastern deserts in Oregon, and he will be presenting about Bird Alliance's black oyster catcher monitoring. So take it away, Joe.
Hey, everybody. Appreciate the invite for this cool event tonight. It's interesting learning about all these different projects, and I'm going to keep on with the bird theme and talk about this very handsome bird, the black oyster catcher. Maybe not quite as cute as the snowy plover, but you know. The Black Oyster Catcher project has been going on for almost 10 years. In 2025, it will be 10 years since we started this program. And, you know, just attest to what Marina talked about before is how with community science, it's often you have the flexibility to have projects that cover a wider range and also a longer time span. So that's been the case for this project. And you can see it wouldn't be, obviously wouldn't be, we couldn't do it without the work of the volunteers, obviously, and also all these partners that you see on the bottom of the screen here. So the goals of the Oregon Black Oyster Catcher Project are kind of split into two areas. One is the science and management part. So our goals are to estimate the population size of this bird in Oregon, get an idea of their spatial distribution and how they're doing in terms of their nesting success, just like Kara is doing with the plovers. And then how do we use all that information to help best inform management of the species in our state? And then the second big goal is to just increase awareness and engagement around not just the species, but the habitat that it resides in and how that can help inform our broader conservation policy initiatives at the Bird Alliance of Oregon. So go ahead to the next slide. So why should you care about black oyster catchers? Well, besides the fact that they're really cool birds, they're also a shorebird like the snowy plover, but they're in a different family And they are a species of conservation concern. They're not in the endangered species list like the plover, but they are definitely a species of conservation concern in Oregon. They're listed in the Oregon Conservation Strategy that ODFW has. They're in the North America Shorebird Conservation Plan. And the reason for that, this concern about them, is they have a small global population. Their range extends from the Aleutians in Alaska all the way down to Baja California, and in that whole area, there's about a population of about 10,000 birds. They're susceptible to climate change impacts and also to human disturbance. And they're a really good indicator of the health of the habitat they live in, and they're really tied to rocky habitats, rocky intertidal habitats, and headlands and things like that. They're also really conspicuous and charismatic, especially during the breeding season. They're hard to mistake. They got that big orange bill, black body, pink legs. They're, it's about the size of a crow. So, for a community scientist, you don't have to be a great bird or anything to identify these birds. You can spot them pretty easily and monitor them pretty quickly and not be, an expert birder. Go ahead to the next slide. So in terms of our data collection, in this phase of the project, we're focusing on nest monitoring and nest searching. In the earlier phase of the project, we were doing abundance surveys. But in terms of nest searching, it requires figuring out where the birds are nesting, which can be tricky, but we do provide these maps, and you can see in the lower right-hand corner of the slide, we provide maps of each of the sites we monitor at, and we monitor about 70 different sites up and down the coast, all the rocky habitat sites we can have access to. And in this map here, you can see where historic nest locations are. And so we provide that to our volunteers. And these birds have a pretty high nest site fidelity, so they'll often come back to the very same nest territories, and even sometimes they even nest scrape that they nested in years before. So that's how we help volunteers kind of find the nests. And then the nest monitoring is basically going to these sites and using a scope or binoculars from a bit of a distance to observe these birds on their nests and figure out if they're incubating, if they're successful or not successful. And the requirement is basically monitoring about a minimum of 30 minutes every 1 to 2 weeks. We like to do it more often, but that's the minimum. And when volunteers are monitoring these nests, they're collecting a whole bunch of other data, the stage the nests are in, the location of the nests, disturbance types of events that are happening, and ultimately we want to know the fate of the nest. Was it successful or did it fail, and why, and what were the reasons behind that? It's also important for us to do public engagement when we're out there. Oftentimes our volunteers are folks come up to them and wondering what they're doing, and so it's a great time to engage the public on this bird, the conservation around it, and also wider conservation issues on the coast. Go ahead to the next slide. Now, in terms of some of the requirements and timeline, if you're interested in engaging on this project, black oyster catchers are nesting generally in Oregon between May and August. So that's the time frame. We have, excuse me, as I mentioned before, 75 sites along the entire Oregon coast that you can adopt and monitor nests at. As I mentioned before, it's typically 2 times a month. We try to monitor the nests. Really, ideally, we're trying to do it once a week or more. And sometimes we're able to do that. We sometimes have a crew of a few different people monitoring one nest site, so they can kind of take turns in a rotation to do that if people are not able to do it as frequently as others. We record our data on a old-fashioned paper data form, and then we transfer it to an online database that we've got set up in ArcGIS. And we do trainings. So at the beginning of the season, we do these trainings. They're non-mandatory, and we have our training dates lined up for this season coming up. So on April 30th, we have a virtual training. That'll be starting at 6:30 p.m. And then we have an in-person training on May 10th. That's going to be held at the North Coast Land Conservancy's new facility, Circle Creek Conservation Center in Seaside. So if you're interested, follow up with myself or Kara. Kara is involved in this project too. As I mentioned before, birding skills, you don't really need to have a ton of them because it's a very easy bird to identify. But you do need to have patience. Monitoring nests takes a lot of time to kind of sit there and watch and see what happens, and good attention to detail. In terms of equipment, we can't provide binoculars, so we require volunteers to provide those. We do have a couple extra spotting scopes sometimes we can lend out, but it's ideal if you have your own. And transportation is your own responsibility. We do have volunteers, a lot of them on the coast. Some of them are based in Portland or inland, and they come out once or twice a month to monitor. So go ahead to the next slide. So jumping right into results. Back in the early part of this project, back in 2015 through the first few years of the project, we were really focused on identifying, trying to figure out the population size of this bird in Oregon because there hadn't been a good estimate for that. So at that time, volunteers were just counting the birds in these 75 different survey routes. And based on that information, we were able to publish that in a peer-reviewed journal and found that we basically have about 500 to 600 black oyster catchers in Oregon. It's a small population, but it seems to be relatively stable over the 3 years that we included data in this analysis. The nest densities appear to be bigger on the south coast. When you look at that map on the right side of the screen, you can see the bigger the gray dot means the higher density of oyster catcher. You can see on the south coast there's bigger gray dots there. It's probably tied to habitat, although we didn't look at specific habitat variables in our estimate. We go on to the next slide. The more recent study, we teamed up with National Audubon and who is monitoring black oyster catchers in California. We pooled our data in Oregon with their data, did an analysis looking at a number of different variables related to the nest productivity or the success of the nests, if they were able to produce young or not. And so just generally what we found, one of our key results is that productivity in the northern part of of this area, basically up in Oregon and down in southern Oregon, down into Northern California, or actually just in northern Oregon, we found that productivity was okay, and you can see that that dashed line on the graph. That indicates at the threshold at which we start to worry about the productivity being so low that the population will decline. So you can see in Northern Oregon, most of Oregon, we have it looks to be a pretty stable population, but as we go down south into California, the population of oyster catchers isn't doing so well. Go ahead to the next slide. So how has this informed policy and management? Number one, our volunteers and the data that we collected have helped identify where to put signage. And we've worked with a couple agencies, U.S. Fish and Wildlife and Oregon State Parks, to develop the signage. You can see an example right here. We have both stationary signage that we have established at a number of sites year round, but we also have temporary signage that we give to our volunteers, like this volunteer here on the North Coast. When she goes out to monitor the oyster catchers, she can put that signage there and then help that with interpretation. Okay, I got 1 more minute left. I'm almost done. Okay, go ahead to the next slide. And then in terms of other ways that the data we're collecting is informing our policy is we've been using it as part of a process with state parks to develop regulations around drone usage. And if you don't know, the usage of drones can be very detrimental to nesting birds. Birds can perceive them as a predator, attack them, and it can cause nest failure if birds are off their nest for longer and then other predators come by and take out their eggs or young. So we've used our data to kind of estimate what's the level of drone disturbance in Oregon for this particular species. And we found back in 2021, for example, we had an average of 3 drone disturbances per week at oyster catcher nests. And we were invited to be part of a drone working group with Oregon Department of Oregon State Parks to help develop rules around where drones should be allowed and not allowed. So that's been another aspect of this work. Okay, I think we're in the last slide coming up. So finally, we've worked with a number of groups on the coast and agencies and other entities to develop new regulations or new policies around rocky habitat protection on the Oregon coast. And as part of that new policy, there was a RFP process for communities to nominate new sites for stronger protection. And part of that, and this is for rocky habitats, and that was guided in part by the data that we collected from oyster catchers, in addition to other information. So we, through that process, we identified 8 new sites that were nominated for protection, and now they've been adopted by the Oregon Ocean Policy Council and Department of Land Conservation Development, and they are new habitat protected areas on the Oregon coast that have stronger protections and will help benefit oyster catchers. So with that, I will end. Sorry, I went a little bit long, but here we have it.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Really interesting to hear about the drones. I didn't know about that. Um, and with that, we will head to our next project, which will be presented by Allie Brown, who is the participant coordinator for COAST, which is the Coastal Observation and Seabird Survey Team. And Allie's job is to train and assist the approximately 800 active volunteers that go out once a month to conduct beach bird surveys. So take it away, Allie.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I saw some names of our coasters in the participant list, so nice to see you as well. Go ahead and go to the next slide. You did a great intro. Okay, so Coast has been around for around 25 years, and we have between 700 and 800 active participants at any given time. But we're not just in Netarts. That would be really hard to have that many people just in that one part of Oregon. So we have actually over 450 sites, and we range from Northern California all the way up to the tip of Alaska, up to Utqiagvik. And over the 25 years, our participants have found 214 bird species. And my job is to keep all of those participants happy and have all the training they need, all the tools they need, and all of that. All right, next slide, please. The real beating heart of Coast is our coasters, of which some are here today. We have a wide diversity of people. We have families going out together. We have folks from tribal communities, groups that just get together once a month to do this with their friends, people who've met their life partners doing these coast surveys, and even kids. We even have kids who start doing coast surveys with their families and then come back later when they are now able to drive and do it themselves. Next slide, please. And in case this wasn't clear, our survey data is collected on dead birds. Click next and it'll pop up as dead birds. This is a not so fancy way of saying beach cast birds. So we'll say beach cast if we don't want to say dead. And we survey these dead birds for a variety of reasons, but one of the main ones is that they don't move. So they're quite easy to find and identify by anybody. Next slide, please. Our coasters go out anywhere between 1 to 5 hours a month around the same time each month. They get a beach that is their beach. I help pick which beach is your right beach, the one near you. And then depending on how many dead birds they're finding, it could take a lot longer or a lot shorter. They collect information on the condition of the carcasses. They measure certain parts of the carcasses, and then they give those birds their last photographs. And then they use all of the clues that they've gathered in that collecting information and measuring to come up with a species identification. Next slide, please. They do this using our Dead Birds for Dummies guidebook. This guidebook is not made for people who are uber birders. This is for people who maybe don't care what kind of bird it is, but now that it's dead, it's kind of a little more interesting. Going through this guidebook, first we have folks find the foot type family, and they go through a whole key. Once they find that family, they can narrow down to a group of different birds, and then within that, they can find the species and really figure out what each individual bird species is. Next slide, please. All of that data is sent into us, and a lot of people are like, well, how good are people at it? And we have data that says that after doing trainings, after going out and doing this for a little bit, everyone gets much more accurate. So I would say that 88% of folks getting to the right species is better than most field techs would, who work out in our parks. We have a really good system of training people and getting really accurate data. And we can tell it's accurate because we have a wonderful guy on our team who is very, very good at identifying dead birds and looks at every single picture of a dead bird that comes in. And we verify every individual data sheet that gets sent to us. All right, next, please. So the reason we're going out and looking at these dead birds is we want to create a baseline. So we want to know what's normal for bird mortality on our beaches. Next slide. Oh, okay. Can you just keep clicking through? I didn't realize this was one of those. Yeah, there we go. So we want to know what's normal on our beaches. And there's like certain times of year where you're going to encounter more dead birds of different species on your beaches. So one of those is after breeding. Breeding takes a lot of energy. So you'll see more dead birds lying on your beach after that, especially, for example, our common murres, which is a picture under that. They will wash up after breeding. In winter, you'll see more fulmars, northern fulmars washing up because winter, again, takes a lot of energy to survive. There's a lot of storms, it's cold, it's hard. And then in spring as well, during spring migration, you'll see more birds up on our beaches because, again, highly energetic. Next, please. So once we have our baseline, we can lay it over what we actually observed. And we can see that, for example, on this one, like November 2010, maybe there was a few more birds found on the beaches than we would expect according to our baseline. Next, please. But we really want to lay it over multiple years. We don't want to look at just one individual year because that doesn't tell us a ton. So we can see, again, there's sometimes more birds found, sometimes less birds found than we could see with our baseline. Nothing too crazy concerning, however. And this is all the northern outer coast of Oregon that I'm showing right now. So this is all you all. Next slide, please. And when we compare over multiple years in different locations, we may see things like these mass mortality events, these very unusual mortality events, these big red bars popping up. I don't have anything for Oregon here because you all haven't had a crazy mass mortality event, which is great. You've definitely had some larger or some large-ish ones, but not as big as the ones I'm showing here. And we can really see, we can start to look at these and think, why is this happening? So why are we having these mass mortality events? Next slide, please. So this is a very confusing image, but I'm going to draw your attention to the bars down at the bottom. That's our sea surface temperature, or average sea surface temperature. So as you can see, it's getting redder to the right. So we're getting hotter sea surface temperatures to the right. And then the bar with the bubbles on top, those are our mass mortality events. So as sea surface temperature is rising, we can see that our mass mortality events are getting both bigger because the size of the bubble relates to the size of the mortality event, and more frequent. So we can really start to consider, okay, so climate change is happening, sea surface temperatures are rising, this is going to affect our seabirds. Next, please. But to backtrack a little bit to something maybe slightly less sad, but also it's still dead birds, so it's still going to be a little bit sad. Let's talk about common murres. So if you've walked the beach in summer on the Oregon coast, you've probably seen some dead young common murres on the beach. And common murres are really interesting because the chicks, the young ones, they use their colonies at 3 weeks. They hop off a cliff. They can't even fly yet. They don't have feathers that they can fly with. So they end up in the ocean. They meet up with their dads, and then they and their dads try to survive together. Sometimes that doesn't work out. So sometimes they get separated. Sometimes they can't get enough food, and all of that. Next slide. So we get calls about this every summer, every summer. So, and everyone's always like, oh my God, they're all dying. This is worrisome. And I'm here to tell you that the more juvenile common murres you see on your beach, the better, honestly. So this is one of my little data stories. Coast had a hypothesis that If we saw more juvenile common murres on the beach than adult common murres on the beach, that was an indicator that more were fledging, more were jumping off that cliff and ending up in the ocean. They were making it farther. There were more of them being hatching, and there were more of them making it farther. So we thought, okay, more juveniles, better breeding success. In contrast, more adults than juveniles washing up on the beach would mean that the breeding success was not very good in that colony. And this turned out to be true. We were able to see that using beach bird data, that this is true. So the more juveniles you see versus adults, the better. That means that in their colonies, they're doing a great job. Lots of chicks are coming out. It's just quite hard to be a chick in the ocean. Okay, next slide, please. And Coast puts out a lot of outputs. I would say our primary form is in scientific publications that can be used in policy and all sorts of things. We also put out science updates for our community that are less boring to read than scientific publications. And then our data gets requested and used in multiple different ways. So our data was part of listing the marbled murrelets as endangered or threatened. It's used in by a variety of different people. We get data requests all the time. So super helpful to use this data after an oil spill, for example. Our data could be used to litigate the company that was responsible for spilling the oil. Okay, and then next slide. Last slide, I think. And then lastly, we do have some beaches down in Netarts Bay. A lot of them are being surveyed already. But if you're willing to drive south a little bit or north a little bit, I can find you a beach. And all of our trainings are listed on our webpage at coast.org with 2 S's. Coast has 2 S's under the Join Our Team section. And we will be having some in-person trainings down in Oregon coming up in May. They're not on our website yet, though. So keep an eye out for those. And lastly, we're just so grateful for our citizen scientists for getting out there. Some of them have stuck with us for all of those 25 years, which I think is incredible. And thanks, y'all.
Great, thank you. Also, quick shout out to all of the community scientists and coasters who are on this call. I definitely know of a few who are here and who are finding really cool things on the beach when they go out. So with that, we will move to our last presentation of the evening, which is going to be by Chloe Kennedy, who is currently a wildlife biology intern for the Oregon Coast National Wildlife Refuge Complex based in Newport. So go ahead, Chloe.
Awesome. Well, thank you for the introduction. Yes, I am the wildlife biology intern, as Marina mentioned. And in my position, I was starting for our refuge complex, at least, seabird productivity monitoring, which is what I'm going to talk about tonight. So next slide. So this, like I mentioned, is the first year that we specifically have been doing this sort of productivity monitoring. I know there are many places up and down the coast and people who have done productivity monitoring in a very similar way, including like Bird Alliance and many others. So this is not a new adventure, but it's new for us. Our primary goal is to gather multiple years of data on the 3 different types of cormorants on the coast: double-crested, brants, and pelagic, along with common murre. We didn't do murre any this past year, but we hope to incorporate that more going forward. So our whole goal is to collect reproductive data at our sites across the coast to track reproductive success, changes in abundance, and just see how predation is impacting those colonies. Again, 2024 was our first year of the survey, so it will be a baseline for us going forward. And as I'm sure many of you know, reproductive success estimates are just so important to understanding the health of both an ecosystem and a species. And seabirds are just very important indicators of ecosystem health and are always super fun to watch. So next slide. So for volunteering, this past summer we had 3 different survey locations, down at Hasita Head near Florence, Cape Meares, and up near Cape Falcon. Each of these locations were surveyed twice a week. We currently only have 1 to 2 interns based out of Newport running the entire survey and sort of getting this ball rolling. So volunteers are very important and we really appreciate their help. Training is very simple. We typically would meet the volunteer out for the first day, walk through the survey with them, and any other surveys that they wanted us to walk through with them. There's no specific bird identification in the survey. We go through beforehand and identify what colonies are made up of before the surveys start. So that takes a little bit of the pressure off volunteers in bird IDing. You won't have to do any of that in these surveys. Volunteers are assigned to one site and survey once a week or as able. If in the future we have larger amount of volunteers, it could end up being more like once a month or twice a month, but at least as of last summer, it was about once a week. Next slide. So what is the survey specifically? The survey takes anywhere from 15 to 60 minutes, really depends on the year. Cape Falcon does take longer due to a hike down to the viewing location. Scopes and tripods are provided unless you have a personal one, but personal binoculars are recommended. And all other survey equipment is provided. We take data with pen and paper. Unless you do prefer electronic form, then we do have that available. So essentially, the survey consists of setting up your scope at the colony. We have detailed colony maps that show the numbered nests and where they should be on the rock. And then you use your scope and take the time to watch each nest and take down information on things like if the nest is still there, is it empty or destroyed? Where's the adult in relation to the nest? So is it sitting on the nest or is it just sitting beside the nest? And then later in the season, the amount of eggs, amount of chicks, the sizes of the chicks, and then of course throughout the whole season, any accounts of nest predation. Next slide. Like I said, this is our first year of this survey, so we do not have a lot of results as of right now. Our data is still currently being worked on by our data managers, so there are no official numbers, but we did see some specific trends throughout the season. I'm going to focus on Cape Meares since it is in our area of interest, and it's also a national wildlife refuge, which makes it even more important for us. So we had 2 colonies at Cape Meares at the start of this season. Plot 1 started with about 10 nests, while plot 2 started with about 20 nests. And these nests were both on a cliff face, pretty separated from one another. Plot 2, the one that started with 20 nests, was on the far edge of the cliff, and it was the main target for a lot of predation from bald eagles. At one point, I saw 2 adults and a juvenile predating on the colony at one point. So even though the colony started with really high numbers for nests, the entire colony ended up being abandoned by the end of the summer, actually pretty early on in the summer, and we didn't see any successful fledglings from it. The plot 1, that was the smaller colony, I don't think it finished with as many nests that it started with, but there were definitely a handful of fledglings, and at one point we saw a lot of new nests pop up. But some of them were abandoned throughout this season, but we still saw some fledglings from that plot. Next slide. So this is an example of the colonies we were looking at. So this is plot 1. This is the one that did have some successful fledglings at the end of the season. It is much more like into the little cove that we were looking at. So it was a little bit more protected compared to the other plot on the next slide. This is plot 2. This is what it looked like at the beginning of the season. It's on the very edge of the cliff, and it essentially was basically a landing strip for eagles, as we noticed throughout this season. Next slide. This is the entire. I'm sure if you've been to Cape Mears, this looks familiar. This is what we were looking at. So, one of those plots was on the far left side, and one of them was closer to the right side of the image. Next slide. So as I've kind of mentioned, our results, we have some ideas of what exactly happened throughout the season. Since plot 1's nests were on a pretty vertical cliff face on really small ledges, there wasn't as much room for predators to land. So we didn't really notice any eagles or any other birds impacting that. I don't know if we ever saw any reason why any nests in that plot were abandoned, but we never saw any predation specifically. Whereas plot 2, again, like I said, was just like a landing strip for eagles, and it was very accessible. It was right on the edge of the cliff and was just very geographically accessible for predators, and was higher up on the cliff, which made it a lot easier to see. So plot 1 was just overall more protected. This is a picture of one on the left of one of our predators that I saw right before this. It was harassing one of the colonies. We did have a peregrine falcon that we saw several times throughout the season. I never saw it go close to either of the colonies, but we're not there 24/7, so who knows if it was up to any mischievous things, but we just usually saw it on a tree nearby, but they were there. So that is something to note. But next slide. So applications. Since this is such a new survey for us, we are still mulling over, what we're going to do with the results that we get from our data. But in the case of the survey, especially those within the National Wildlife Refuge complex, learning reproductive success estimates are super important for us in our future strategies and management actions. Every single island off the coast is a part of our complex. So looking at these islands and the birds and how their reproductive success is super important for us going forward, making sure that we're managing these areas correctly and in the way that these birds need. And I believe that's the last slide.
Awesome. Thank you so much. It is really awesome to have such a cool mix of projects presented today. I'm glad that we get to cover the whole life cycle of birds, from fledging to dead birds. So we are going to go ahead and move along to the panel discussion part of our evening. So I'm going to stop screen sharing. And if we can have all the panelists have our cameras on, so it feels like we're all in the same room together having a panel discussion. Awesome. So I've got a few questions, and I will start them with one panelist and then open it up for more responses. So my first question for you, and we'll start this with Jess with NOAA Marine Debris, is that a common concern that we hear from community scientists, from professional scientists, from policymakers, from people who don't know anything about community science, pretty much everybody, is how can we trust the quality of data that is being produced by community scientists, given their relatively limited training and in many cases limited field supervision from professional scientists. So I'm curious if you could speak a little bit to how you would respond to somebody raising these concerns, and how do you approach the verification of data quality in your project?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's reasonable, right? Because we trust that scientists are trained to do these like higher level studies. But you made a lot of good points in the earlier part of the webinar about, how community scientists can get involved and it still maintain, quality. For MDMAP specifically, our protocol is clear and simple, and we do that intentionally to make sure that it's accessible for anyone who wants to do it, but still remains scientifically rigorous. Our training materials, they're super accessible online. So even if someone was trained, 3 years ago and needs a refresher, they can do it as often as they need to. We're available for one-on-one support through our email if anyone needs specific things that aren't addressed in our resources. And, going from, helping the surveyor to the data that's submitted, each and every single survey that's submitted to us is verified by hand by myself and my team member. So we check the data for reasonability, make sure it's accurate to any photos if they're submitted, and verify that it's aligned with our protocol. This process is pivotal to ensuring that the data has and continues to be used, in community policy and peer-reviewed science. In terms of addressing specific concerns, thankfully we haven't had any direct concerns come to us yet, but in anticipation of this, we're working on documenting our verification process and making that publicly available, as well as developing a data labeling system to provide more transparency for those who want to access and use the data for scientific research or any other policy information.
Great, thank you. I also wanted to ask, Joe, you had mentioned some management, like influencing management decisions and policy decisions with Black oyster catcher data. So I'm wondering if you'd like to speak to this question a little bit also about data verification.
Sure. I mean, I think a lot of what Jeff said is applicable to what, we do. I think having a good training in advance, and a clear protocol, simple protocol that people can follow is important. I think data proofing, once the data is collected by the volunteers, we're always available to answer questions during the field season at any time, to help, ensure the data is being collected in the way we need it to be collected. And we do have mentors. We have our more experienced volunteers that have done it for multiple seasons, and we know collect really good data. We often pair them with volunteers that are new, to get them up to speed on the protocol. And a lot of our data analysis is done. We either people that are qualified like myself, or hiring out a biostatistician to help, or working with partners to do that. Part of the work is important, and also that comes into play with the study design that we set out in advance of the project being on the ground, making sure that's something that would be compatible with volunteers can do. And also, I would just say that I've been on a lot of different field crews in my career, and even in academic institutions, you have very green field assistants that often aren't trained well collecting data. So I think there's this perception that community scientists are like people that don't know what they're doing sometimes, but I think it really depends on the project. And if you put the work into it up front, you can actually be collecting better data than in some academic institutions. And finally, I just want to say that, we can't go through this process by saying that federal agencies right now are in a really bad place. And there's some people on this call that, are in the situation right now that is difficult. And I think we need to recognize that and show solidarity with our federal workers that are on the ground day to day doing this work. And I think volunteers are a big part of helping to provide capacity to not just NGOs like Bird Alliance, but also agencies to collect the data that needs to be collected. So I'll stop there.
Yes, awesome. Thank you for bringing that up. Supporting community science efforts is more important than ever. So hopefully some of our audience members are getting inspired to join some of these projects. Did anybody else on the panel want to jump in on this question about data quality and verifying data? Now we can go ahead and move to our next question.
I would
All right.
throw in that I think community science is like the secret superpower of conservation. I think there are so many benefits to it. Marina, you mentioned earlier, like the power of numbers. Like we can expand our studies to much broader scale when we have so many more boots on the ground and eyes on the beach. Like eBird is a perfect example of that. The North American Breeding Bird Survey is a great example of that. Um, and funding limitations. I think we all know there's not a lot of money in wildlife conservation, and some programs just wouldn't be possible without community scientists dedicating their time. And you get such a great diversity of skills, expertise, perspectives that can be hugely beneficial. And there's just kind of education and outreach at the root of all of it. They're learning how to be scientists themselves, but they're also taking information home with them and spreading the word about conservation issues. So I think it's really, really cool.
Yes, awesome. I'm gonna take your point to segue to our next question. So I'm interested to hear what you all hope that volunteers will gain from their participation in your projects. So I'm gonna throw this one to Chloe first. And yeah, I think it's so important that as volunteers, there is benefit. There's learning opportunities. There's all sorts of different benefits, both for the scientific community, but also for all of the individual people who are spending tons and tons of time walking the beach and collecting data. So I'm interested to hear for each of your projects specifically what volunteers can gain.
Yeah, so for productivity monitoring specifically, it's a great way to just get out there and just get to watch birds through various phases of development. You get kind of attached to the nests, and it's just kind of a fun time getting to watch them. But also, I know that productivity monitoring as a form of survey is just it's very widespread, and it's a survey that is all over the world, I'm sure. So it gets you great experience with certain protocol that may be used in other surveys you may help with down the road. But one of the other main things that I hope that volunteers gain from our survey specifically is just connections with the community. These surveys usually happen during the busiest times of the year when you're out on some of the busiest trails on the coast, and you run into people on vacation and people who are doing their daily walks, and you get to talk with them about what you're looking at and the different wildlife and conservation things you're working with. And I think it's a great way to sort of participate in science outreach in a very low key way. You don't have to be a professional or a professor or anything in that regard. You can just be helping doing community science and teaching people who are walking by, which I think is awesome.
So cool. Thank you. I love the idea of spending my summer watching baby birds hatch and fledge. It sounds amazing. Do we have any other panelists who wanted to jump in on that question, on what you hope people will gain from participating in your project specifically?
At Coast, we hope that you start noticing all the changes in your beach. Because if you go out once a month to the same location, you start seeing small things and small changes. And that can really develop a sense of place for you all. And it also can get you interested in what's happening in your world, because once you focus in, you're able to see a broader picture. So getting outside, seeing those changes, and yeah, becoming scientists. I mean, I think it's a great way to observe our environment.
Yeah, I'll chime in
Yeah, go
real
ahead.
quick as
Thank you.
well. From our perspective, learning, just having that community when you're together with people outside, kind of doing anything is amazing. But I know that the times that I've spent cleaning up with people, you're sharing silly things you see, and like I found circuit boards on the beach and like office chairs. Like it's just really weird stuff that you expect straws and bottles, but to share these things with these people and like Ali said, learn about the coast, not just go out one time and pick up beach, but your beach and what's common there after a while. And we see in the people's notes like, what kind of trends they're seeing and these little comments they have. It's just a really wonderful way to build community and give back.
Awesome. Thank you so much. It looks like we are coming close to the end of our time, and I want to make sure that we have time for some audience questions. So I am going to turn it over to Chrissy. Chrissy, I'm going to spotlight you so you can join the panel here.
Okay, exciting.
To ask our audience questions from the chat.
You bet. So we did get a few questions in. Some people are offering answers in the chat, but we're just fielded for everybody. Kind of briefly summarize anyway. If you have a question, there's still time, so just go ahead and plop it in the chat, and we will ask it to our panelists. So the first question was after the NOAA marine debris presentation, and it was about where the sites are specifically in Netarts. So Jess, if you want to highlight those.
Yeah, sure. So the two sites in Netarts Bay are surrounding Cape Lookout. So it's Cape Lookout main site and then the Cape Lookout spit.
Awesome. Thank you. And those are Webb's managed sites, actually. So if you're interested in getting involved in walking the beach and looking for marine debris, then you can reach out to Marina and we will get you hooked up. We also use these sites to bring out students, and there's also a curriculum online that NOAA Marine Debris created, and we use one of these sites to bring out classes every year, a couple times a year. So our next question is related to the plover presentation from Kara. What is the likelihood we'll be able to help manage plover populations? I got to scan over because I can't see it all on the North Coast by removing European and beach grass. So if you can speak to that, there's two questions that are actually related. If you can summarize how you answered those, that'd be wonderful.
Yeah, totally. So European beach grass is unlikely to be eradicated from the West Coast, but we can manage for it. And this has been done already along the Oregon coast. So in certain designated habitat restoration areas, we can use mechanical equipment to mechanically remove European beach grass, grade the dune to create a gradually sloping dune. And the European beach grass does come back with a vengeance quickly, so it does need to be treated usually on an annual or biannual basis with typically herbicide. But that mechanical equipment is really useful for just kind of initially tearing it out. But plovers absolutely use those habitat restoration areas. They've been really, really helpful for plovers recovery along the Oregon coast.
Thanks, Kara. Our next question goes back to about marine debris. And so the question was, why do you think there was a jump in debris load in January 2024?
Yeah, so if it speaks to how easy it is to navigate our site, after that question came through the chat, I did go back and look. And it looks like from the comments that there was like a gathering on the beach that they kind of noticed the debris from afterwards. So just people existing and leaving their stuff, unfortunately.
Got it. I think that is the end of what I see in the chat. So if anybody else has questions, they can answer. Totally have time to type them in, but otherwise I'll hand it back to you, Marina, to do whatever wrap up you want to do.
Awesome. Thank you. So I want to say a huge thank you to all of our panelists, both for coming and being here tonight and telling us about the work you're doing, and also for doing all of this important work to protect our coastal ecosystems. It is incredibly important, again, now more than ever. And we're just really grateful that you're doing it, and creating opportunities for community members to get engaged. And I also want to say thank you to all of our audience members for joining this event. I hope that this gives you a little bit of a sense of optimism, if you will, climate optimism, with like tangible ways that you can get involved. These projects are really truly making a difference, and they are open to you to participate and to contribute, which is really an amazing thing. And I'm glad that we have been able to come together and share about that tonight. So with that, I am going to share our presentation screen again. And okay, this is our final presentation image. You will notice there is a QR code on this screen. If you have a moment, we would love to hear your thoughts on this event. This is a super short survey. I promise it'll take you 2 minutes and no more. But we really truly do use your feedback when we're planning our next events. We, the web staff, had met a little while ago and looked at all of the feedback from all of these surveys and have used that in planning this year's surveys, or this year's community events. An example I will give you, so you know what's coming down the line, is that we got some feedback from one of these surveys that people were interested in learning more about green crabs, because they are an invasive species of concern in the Netarts Bay area. So coming up in April, we will be having a presentation on green crabs. So if you have topics that you would like to learn more about, this is your opportunity to tell us, and we will do our best to find speakers, find experts who can come talk about that, find opportunities to go outside and learn together. That is really what we are here to do. But we need to know what you're interested in. All of that, the survey link, along with additional information about all of these projects and how you can get involved, will also be shared with you in an email after this event. So if you don't feel like scanning the QR code right now, that is okay. You will have more opportunities and more information coming your way. So with that, I will just say thank you again for joining us today, and I hope you have a great rest of your evening.
Thanks, Webs.